sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. The topic of today's episode is something that I'm sure many people have heard of, but I'm also sure that there's probably a lot of people who haven't heard of it. It's actually somewhat of a controversial subject, and that would be certain cities across the world in various countries working to allow prescription heroin for opioid addiction. And to be honest with you, when I first heard of this, I thought it was a ridiculous idea, until I did a little bit of research on the subject myself. The biggest factor for this idea comes mainly from a harm reduction point of view. And the idea is that if doctors allow opioid addicts and heroin addicts to get their heroin through a legal prescription from an actual pharmacy rather than on the street or what have you, this will in turn reduce overdose deaths in the long run. This is mainly because the heroin that people would be receiving through a prescription program is just pure heroin. It's not mixed with dangerous stuff like fentanyl or carfentanil or who knows what else. At least with programs like this, addicts will have a safe environment to use their clean heroin in a safe and doctor-supervised setting. And judging from various pilot programs which have already begun doing this, the results speak for themselves. In this episode, we are going to discuss some of the various countries that are trying this idea out, while also discussing the pros and cons of this idea. To me, it really seems like strictly a harm reduction kind of deal rather than an actual treatment, which we will also be discussing in this episode. As usual, before we dive right in, I want to make a simple request from all of you magnificent listeners. If you get a chance and you listen to the show on Apple Podcasts, be sure and leave us a rating and a review if you get a chance. The more reviews we have on Apple Podcasts, the easier it's going to be for other people to find the show, so that is really going to help us out. Alternatively, if you're not into the whole iTunes or Apple Podcasts kind of thing, you can feel free to leave us a review for the show on our Facebook page at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. And who knows, in some of the future episodes I may even read some of the reviews on the air. And thank you all in advance for that. Again, it really helps the show kind of stay easily searchable for those who are looking for it. And one more thing, I do want to remind everyone that we have some new content available on our Patreon page at patreon.com/addictions. From there, for as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to the majority of the extra audio and video content that I produce for the show. It is not available anywhere else, so be sure to go and check that out. Again, that's at patreon.com/addictions. It's patreon.com/addictions. Now, if you're not interested in any of that extra bonus content, that's cool. We also take one-time donations of any size through PayPal, which we have a link set up at addictionspodcast.com/donate now. And as always, you can visit us at addictionspodcast.com to stay up to date on all things Addictions Podcast. We also have links on how to support the show and links to all of the available episodes, along with a ton of incredibly valuable resources for anyone who's struggling with addiction. And as always, thank you all so much for your ongoing support and for listening to this show. Now let's get down to business. Today we are talking about prescription heroin, and I know the first time that most people hear this, it sounds like a terrible idea. treating heroin addicts with heroin. I mean, like, seriously, what the hell? But it isn't really a treatment, but rather more of a harm reduction strategy or technique in an effort to provide heroin addicts with clean heroin that isn't spiked with other deadly substances like fentanyl. Now, real quick, I'm going to play an excerpt from a recent news story where we actually hear one of the leading proponents of prescription heroin explaining the idea. So here we go with that.
The U.S. government treats heroin addiction as a law enforcement problem. But around the world, other governments treat it as a medical condition. Switzerland is one of the richest and most conservative countries in Europe. But during the 80s and 90s, Switzerland was in the grips of a heroin plague. In the capital Bern, drug-related crime was through the roof. Heroin was a national disgrace.
I used to live right next to that needle park. It was horrible. People died there. There was petty crime all around in the city. It was just totally out of hand. It was a terrible situation.
In response to public outcry, the government comes up with a solution beyond clean needles and drug counseling. A revolutionary program that offers free heroin to addicts who meet certain criteria and have a doctor's prescription. And it's all courtesy of the Swiss taxpayers. Dr. Christoph Berkey is part of the radical experiment. His clinic in Bern is one of 23 centers around the country that dispense heroin like medicine.
So this is where we keep the heroin. It comes in those 10 grams ampules that will later on be dissolved with sterile water.
Every patient in this clinic receives a controlled dose of pharmaceutical-grade heroin.
And as you can see, it's a transparent, clear fluid. It's nothing compared to that soup-like consistency of the street heroin in a syringe. Here it's 100% pure heroin.
Before Berkey's clinic, heroin addiction forced his patients into a life of crime, prostitution, and homelessness. They were disconnected from medical services and addiction treatment.
The type of patient we have in this clinic is a different one. It's a patient that we normally don't get in touch with. They were out on the street, but we didn't really get in touch with. We couldn't really integrate them into a treatment. Now here it's possible. They do come every day.
Dr. Berkey has no illusions about why his patients come to him.
They come to me because I or my team provides them with the heroin. But through that contact, we can start making other things an issue. We can start working really on mental health issues as well as on other issues in their life. And that's the core value of heroin prescription. It's incredible and I like it every day. You get in touch with people through this type of treatment that before that in the professional field we did not get in touch with. So this is absolutely fascinating.
The free heroin program may be controversial, but there's been a 60% drop in felonies committed by its patients since it began, and the overall societal cost per addict has been cut in half. The program doesn't solve every problem, but it does reduce the impact of some of Switzerland's most troubled addicts.
Like that audio excerpt explained, many countries, mainly the United States, have this hang-up with substance abuse and addiction, mainly seeing it as a criminal offense punishable in various ways. But that is a huge part of the problem. We desperately need to move away from that punishment model and work towards the more sympathetic and common sense treatment and maintenance type of programs. Another thing that the audio excerpt explained was that most substance abuse typically stems from previously existing mental conditions, and this is just another reason that punishment is not the answer to the current opioid epidemic. So far, there are only a small handful of countries that are attempting this idea of prescription heroin, namely Canada and Switzerland. There are a few more countries in Europe as well, but Canada and Switzerland are so far the big two. Now let's move forward a little bit and talk about some of the many positive aspects of this subject. One of the biggest would be the reduction in crime. For example, since Switzerland has implemented this program, they've seen a substantial drop in crime related to heroin addiction. This is because many addicts will often engage in things like petty theft or, stealing from basically anyone in an effort to sell those stolen goods to make money to purchase heroin on the street. I mean, I wasn't hooked on heroin, but I was hooked on opioids, and honestly, I sold things, I stole things to buy drugs. But anyways, not only do we see a reduction in crime, but even bigger than that, in my opinion, we see a huge reduction in the overdose death rate associated with heroin, often being cut with more powerful drugs like fentanyl or even carfentanil. That stuff is so potent that it can be absorbed through your skin just by touching it. This is simply because pharmaceutical heroin is nothing more than straight, unadulterated heroin. No fentanyl. Don't get me wrong, heroin on its own can and has caused countless overdose deaths. But again, as I stated earlier, these heroin prescriptions are generally closely monitored under doctor supervision. So the addict will have a safe place to use and may in fact also be more likely to get into a treatment program and thus on the road to recovery. The website drugwarfacts.org lists off many of the benefits that programs like this are likely to promote. Evidence shows that these types of programs are feasible and associated with a number of positive outcomes, including but not limited to helping people to stop or reduce their illegal drug use, avoiding illness or death from an overdose by ensuring access to a drug of known quality and strength, a retention in medical care, facilitating a gradual change from heroin use to opioid substitution therapy, reducing the spread of disease due to unsafe injection practices on the street, reducing crime related to the acquisition of illegal drugs, and reducing the sale of black market heroin. Okay, now moving on, we do need to address some of the more negative aspects of the idea of providing legal prescription heroin to drug addicts. In some ways, I see it as just giving the addict a justification to just keep using. And I'm sure there are many addicts that probably get into these types of programs for that exact reason. But again, the addict is in a clinical setting and probably more likely than not that over time they will choose to get into a more in-depth recovery and treatment program. And in the long run, the pros definitely outnumber the cons here. In fact, research done in both European nations and Canada have both seen better health outcomes for heroin addicts through these types of prescription heroin programs, as well as improvements in social functioning, lower rates of repeat drug crime offenses, and just a better quality of life for heroin addicts struggling to gain a foothold to deal with the roots of their substance abuse problems, and thus the ability to become functioning members of society, and that's really a big one. When we compare these results with the results of the United States punishment/rehab and treatment programs, we see a huge difference in success rates and recovery rates. Beyond the punishment model in the USA, which simply just doesn't work, even the rehabilitation and recovery programs in the USA, they do not boast nearly the success rates of countries offering this prescription heroin program. Now, I'm not saying that prescription heroin is for everyone with an opioid addiction. For example, if you have a minor habit of using hydrocodone every day, prescription heroin is only going to turn a molehill into a mountain. And this would be incredibly counterintuitive. But when I look at heroin use and overdose in the USA, I truly feel like a prescription heroin program, which would of course be highly regulated, is going to make some major positive differences. Again, going back to heroin treatment here in the United States, much of the focus in the US is on abstinence, which is rather dangerous when we're dealing with opioids like heroin. Again, if a person simply quits heroin cold turkey, they will quickly lose their tolerance that they have built up over years of use. So if they were to relapse, they may in fact overdose and die because they are no longer able to handle the high doses of heroin that they once were able to handle before the abstinence. And this model of abstinence only generally occurs when a person is required to go through what's called drug court here in the USA, and often called mental health court as well, which for most addicts is an insanely difficult struggle to just quit heroin or other opioids cold turkey, not to mention how dangerous it is as well. But the courts will often force this on addicts and not even allow maintenance drugs like Suboxone or methadone. This, in turn, often leads to a violation of probation and subsequent jail time, which can often tear families apart and cause nothing but more harm and a vicious cycle of being in and out of jail and relapse after relapse. So it's really not helping the problem. It is truly my hope that one day here in the United States that the government and law enforcement will distance themselves from these unfair and really inhumane punishments of people who have chronic medical conditions like substance abuse disorders. Because deep down, they are not criminals, they are humans. And they should be afforded all of the same basic human rights that everyone else is. They deserve that. We must all begin advocating for better treatment and recovery programs here in the United States and urge our lawmakers to come to their senses in this regard. The war on drugs needs to end. We should not be waging war on our own citizens, for Christ's sake. We are all human. As always, I want to thank each and every one of you for tuning into this episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. And again, just a friendly reminder, if you get a chance, shoot us a review on iTunes or Facebook at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. And as always, never quit quitting.
You spent your money freely, then you smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. Your Sundays you prayed Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after the buzz is gone.